The fella once said, ain't that a kick in the head?
All right, really excited about our next guest. We had an off-air conversation that got me thinking about some of the ways that I live and what are we doing in my area, and it's meaning in all kinds of walks of life, and especially when it comes to overpopulation, pollution, that kind of stuff. So Jeb Taylor is with us in our Author's Corner, and he's written a book called A Handbook for Humanity, and it's really seeking out sustainability in the 21st century. Think of that in your mind. I don't want to take up more of his time, so let's go to Jeb. Jeb, thanks so much for popping on with us.
Oh, I'm really pleased to be here. Thanks.
You and I, like I said, had this great conversation about what people either don't realize they're doing or have kind of ignored. What is your greatest fear for humanity in writing this book and all the things that you uncovered and things you knew intellectually? What's your biggest fear for mankind?
Well, the biggest fear is obviously that we are not taking care of our planet, and we are, quite quickly at this stage making Earth so that it can't sustain us. And my biggest concern is that civilization will collapse, and that I think is a very real concern. And it's not something that's down the pike in hundreds of years or something. I think that we'll see this if we don't change our perspectives and behavior in the next generation or so.
When did you wake up to this and realize, boy, this is kind of scary what I'm seeing?
When I was about 10 years old, back in around 1960, I was very concerned about this, and I spent my entire life trying to understand, the dynamics between, human beings, our behavior, and sustainability. And more recently, how technology ties into that. So it's been a long process for me.
Yeah. So tell us, as you started this book, and when we talk about a handbook for humanity, what was it that as you were writing it started to become abundantly clear to you, and how do you get the readers to understand that? Because that's such a big subject to tackle.
Oh, it's huge. And the difficulties are enormous. This is actually the third book that I've written, with this in mind, with this premise in mind, the premise being that civilization is in trouble, and the intent is to raise our awareness and alter our behavior so that we can achieve sustainability. One of the first things that I ran across that I didn't really deal with in the first two books was that I could not address the issues that need to be addressed with the words that we have at our disposal. We have so thoroughly confused what we know with what we believe that we are all very, very deluded, and it's absolutely essential if we're going to move forward and survive that we begin to separate what we know, what we believe, and use what we know to act rationally in the future. So actually one of the first things that I had to do, and this was very difficult, was to refine the definitions of a number of words.
Wow. So you had to do that throughout the book so everybody would understand, correct?
Yes. And it was actually, this is really bizarre, is that I actually had to do that so that I could have clear thoughts about what I wanted to talk about.
Wow.
There were no words, or the words were, had different meanings and stuff. So I thought about making up new words, and I ran this by friends, and they said, "Oh, Jeb, you can't do that." It's like, I can't not do that and get this message out. So it seems very simple when you see it in the book, but I refined the definitions of words, and it wasn't like changing the definitions. It was like restricting them to mean very specific things. So anybody that reads this book, I highly recommend that they start at the very beginning and read it sequentially all the way through, because there are so many parts of the book, in the middle and the end of the book, that require information that was provided in the beginning of the book.
Yeah, and again, the book is A Handbook for Humanity, Seeking Sustainability in the 21st Century. We're speaking with Jeb Taylor. You can get it on Amazon.com. Okay, what about, when we look, and you and I talked about this, what about the clash of technology and what's happening socially in our communities? What do you see the breakdown being there?
Well, it's interesting. For the first half of my life and my concern, I just blamed technology like lots of people do. And I assumed that the only way to solve our problems was to regress technologically. But I no longer, well, first of all, it's not going to happen. People are not going to voluntarily adopt, regress technologically. We're so hooked on modern conveniences and inventions and stuff. We're not going to do that. But it also occurred to me that it was not technology per se that was the problem. It was our irresponsible use of technology that was the problem. So then the question then became, how do we change our behavior? And it's very simple to say, oh, we just have to behave more responsibly. That is not the case. Our behavior is based on our perspectives, and our perspectives are based on what we believe, and we are holding beliefs that were established 4,000 years ago, and we are basically trying to manage modern technologies with perspectives and personalities that were established thousands and thousands of years ago. There's a very fundamental difference between living in a primitive state and living in a civilized state. And that moment, that threshold, was when we adopted agriculture about 10,000 years ago. Once we did that, we committed ourselves to all future generations to technology. And one thing we don't talk about is that we also committed ourselves to adopting progressive social behavior, commensurate with those technologies. We have to learn to use them responsibly, and that's where we have failed.
Wow. And just thinking about that, I love how you mentioned, we're not going to give up technology. We're not winding that clock back. So how do we move forward with that? And I started off in this interview talking about population and pollution and what's happening in so many other areas. And, as much, Jeb, as we see steps forward, there's so many steps being taken backwards, aren't there?
Oh, yes. It's not so much that the steps are being taken backwards, it's that the level of concern is limited to people who have progressive attitudes, and they are fighting, desperately to try to, alleviate these problems as they occur. But the problems are occurring much faster than we are currently able to alleviate them. Certainly, people have made giant achievements. Claire Patterson was one. Rachel Carson was another. People do make a difference, and they change how we perceive things and how we act. So all the things are possible, but generally speaking, I think we have to encourage people to raise their awareness all across the board. That isn't just Americans, that's everybody in the world. And that entails, education, and more than anything, it entails that we have to give up, and this is where things get hard, and this is where things will be really highly resisted, is that we have to actually transcend what we believe and begin to rely on what we know in basing our opinions and our behavior.
And don't you think there's such a resistance to change?
Oh, huge. But it's not so much the resistance to, yes, there's a resistance to change, but we've been indoctrinated. Keep in mind that we have been indoctrinated our entire lives to maintain beliefs, whether they're national or religious or economic or racial or gender or whatever. We grow up, and whether somebody, hammers it into our head is not the point. We are exposed to it, and we copy our parents. I mean, that's how all living organisms that have parents learn to live in the world, is they emulate their parents. So if our parents have irrational beliefs or ideas or behaviors, very likely we're going to grab them, and that's going to state how we're going to live, and it's also something we're going to pass on to our children. We have to break this cycle. It's maintaining the status quo is a death sentence for civilization.
Oh, I love the way you said that, a death sentence, and that's scary to think about that. Pick up Handbook for Humanity, Seeking Sustainability in the 20th Century. And I think we've weaved this into the conversation, but ultimately someone reads it. What do you hope the biggest takeaway is, that they take action?
Yes, and also, this is a publish-on-demand book. It's not, doesn't have a backing if there isn't some big promoter out there. So if you read it, please leave feedback, positive or negative, on Amazon, and encourage other people to read it. Whether you agree with it or not, these are all issues that need to be addressed immediately.
Jeb Taylor.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah, so there are areas that need to be addressed.
I'm sorry?
There are areas that need to be addressed, like you're saying.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And it initially is just, it's changing our behavior, but I address things like pollution, overpopulation, climate change. And at times this book was over 400 pages.
Wow.
Right now but I wanted to make it as readable, and so I made it more and more concise and more and more concise. I think it's a fairly easy book to read, and it should be available, really to anybody that is interested in reading it.
I like that. I was going to say, Jeb Taylor, you are so prolific, and then in cutting it down, you realized, oh, yeah, I definitely have to cut this down. So Jeb Taylor, A Handbook for Humanity, again, seeking sustainability in the 21st century. Pick it up, pass it on, and that's how you can spread the word. Thanks, Jeb.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here.